Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Melinda Smith, and I am the Vice Provost of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and the Associate Vice President, Research, EDI at the University of Calgary. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to our third keynote as part of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Week 2022. The theme for EDI Week 2022 is From Commitment to Action, Building Equitable Pathways and Futures in the University. Our keynote today is by Dr. Kalwant Bhopal, Professor of Education and Social Justice and Director of the Center on Research in Race and Education at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. And she'll be speaking to us on the topic of Black and minority ethnic experiences in higher education, social justice, inclusion, and white privilege. Before we begin with our program, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Wesley's First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Today, we are witnessing a renewed urgency for anti-racism and EDI leadership and action. As Rashid Ogunlaru put it, in leadership, life, and all things, it's wiser, far wiser, to judge people by their deeds than their speech, their track record, than their talk. The theme, From Commitment to Action, Building Equitable Pathways and Futures in the University, reflects the campus community's desire for change. It recognizes that after 3 decades of pursuing employment equity and EDI, we need an urgent reset to move beyond talk, statements, and commitments to concrete actions to affect systemic change. Now, more than ever, there is what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King referred to as the fierce urgency of now. This urgency is anchored in a commitment to fairness that is at the heart of EDI. The principle of fairness was highlighted by Justice Rosalie Silverman Abella in her final report of the Royal Commission on Equality and Employment in 1985. Judge Abella called for concrete measures to ameliorate inequities because, as she put it, it is not fair that many people in these equity groups have restricted employment opportunities, limited access to decision-making processes that critically affect them, little public visibility as contributing Canadians, and a circumscribed range of options generally. It may be understandable, given history, culture, economics, and even human nature, but by no standard is it fair, according to Justice Abella. So we are gathered here in the context of an ongoing racial reckoning, and the COVID-19 pandemic, a pandemic that has exposed and aggravated pre-existing racial inequities and created new ones. There's an urgency to take action to build more equitable pathways and futures in the academy and the broader society for this generation and generations to come. So moving from commitments to action requires an understanding of the principles and the practices of mutuality and accountability. All of us are accountable for this transformation, Yet we know the weight of this change disproportionately falls on those who are already underrepresented and marginalized. In Why We Can't Wait, Dr. King stated that this work must be collaborative. He understood the principle of mutuality. As he put it, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one, directly and indirectly affects us all. EDI Week is an annual week-long series of events and activities to raise awareness, expand EDI literacy and education, engage with the campus community and beyond on how we can work together to close the knowledge, data, and policy gaps, and to think together about reimagining and redesigning a more equitable and inclusive campus and workspace. The events are an integral dimension of our efforts to embed equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in all spheres of university life, in governance and leadership, in admissions, hiring and retention, in teaching and learning, research and scholarship, community engagement, and throughout the living and workspaces of our campus. This year, the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion has coordinated with units across the entire campus community, lectures, workshops, performances, installations, and other events to deepen the University of Calgary's commitment to EDI and to identify barriers and strategies for ameliorating inequities that impede access to and success within the post-secondary institutions. Today, we will be discussing the subject of racial equity or racial justice and why and how Black and minority ethnic staff and students continue to be underrepresented and marginalized in post-secondary education sector. This is true for Canada, it is true for the United Kingdom and the United States. Our keynote speaker, we are fortunate to have, Dr. Bhopal, will explore the topic of Black and minority ethnic experiences in higher education, social justice, inclusion, and white privilege. Our speakers today include the University of Calgary's Provost and Vice President Academic, Dr. Terry Balser, and Dr. Kalwant Bhopal of the University of Birmingham. First, I would like to invite University of Calgary's Provost, Dr. Balser, to share some remarks. Dr. Balser.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. And thank you for the invitation to be part of this event. I'm really looking forward to hearing the keynote. But the University of Calgary is committed to racial justice and to the attendant ongoing work to make our community more equitable, diverse, and inclusive, while actively confronting anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-Asian, and all forms of racism. The university, through the leadership of the Vice Provost Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, has been integrally involved in the development of the Scarborough Charter on anti-Black racism and Black inclusion, an initiative designed to concretely advance the actions of universities across the country to address systemic racism and advance racial equity. Our involvement in this initiative will not only influence the national context, but also help ensure we learn from anti-racism strategies employed across the country. In collaboration with the Office of EDI, we've identified areas in which more progress is needed. First is hiring and retention of minoritized and Indigenous faculty and staff. Over the last year, the university has hired 5 Indigenous scholars and allocated several prestigious Canada research chairs to recruit Indigenous scholars and focus on anti-racism and equity-focused research areas. Second is developing more targeted materials and courses that deal with an understanding of structural racism and discrimination. As part of this effort, we've held sharing circles and engagement sessions with Indigenous and Black faculty and staff, as well as anti-racism workshops for the EDI network in concert with the Students' Union EDI team. Third, addressing structural racism and examining the university's rewards and incentives. We launched an EDI dashboard to help us measure our progress and be accountable for effecting change. Last fall, we also launched new equity censuses to provide an in-depth statistical picture of our community to help us more effectively develop concrete steps to close diversity gaps. The data will be used to craft proactive measures and policies to allow every member of our community to work and study free from discrimination and harassment. Fourth, we're creating more equitable pathways into the university and have undertaken new Black and Indigenous admission and scholarship initiatives. Fifth, we're embedding EDI in our research ecosystem, particularly in our Canada Research Chairs, and by participating in the Federal Dimensions EDI pilot initiative, which will increase EDI's impact on our research ecosystem. Sixth is clarifying racism-related complaints and grievance procedures. The Office of EDI is leading a team developing an anti-racism policy and reporting mechanism. Lastly is examining police and campus security with a focus on transparent reporting. Campus security has begun to examine its language and reporting to better align with the university's commitment to equity, diversity, inclusivity, and respectful Indigenous engagement. We acknowledge there is much work to do still. However, we hope that these actions show the university is making substantive progress toward fostering a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive academic environment and workplace. Yeah. Thank you. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Dr. Kalwant Bhopal is Professor of Education and Social Justice and Director of the Center on Research on Race and Education at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Dr. Bhopal's research focuses on the achievements and experiences of minority ethnic groups in education. She's conducted research on exploring discourses of identity and intersectionality, examining the lives of Black minority ethnic groups, as well as examining the marginal position of gypsies and travelers. Her research specifically explores how processes of racism, exclusion, and marginalization operate in predominantly white spaces with a focus on social justice and inclusion. From 2017 to 2019, she was visiting professor at Harvard University in the Graduate School of Education. Dr. Bhopal has published 9 books, 10 edited collections, and numerous journal articles. Her recent book, White Privilege, The Myth of a Post-Racial Society, was published by Policy Press. Her new book, with Martin Myers, Elites and the Making of Privilege, will be published by Routledge in 2022. I will now turn over the virtual floor to Dr. Kalwant Bhopal. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Balser and Dr. Smith. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and I'm only sorry that I'm not in Calgary. So today I'm going to be talking about Black and minority ethnic experiences in higher education, with a specific focus on social justice, inclusion, and white privilege. Next slide, please. So let's first of all start by policy making. Policy making in the UK paints a very positive picture around social justice and inclusion. We've had the widening participation agenda, which was introduced by the new Labour government. The widening participation agenda is hugely important because it gave the opportunity for students from marginalised communities to enter higher education. In 2000, we had the introduction of the Race Relations Amendment Act. The Race Relations Amendment Act gave us a definition of institutional racism. And in 2010, we had the introduction of the Equality Act. The Equality Act is important because it brings together all previous legislation into one single act. And why is it important? It's important because it includes protected characteristics, of which race is one. We've also had important policy initiatives in higher education, such as, for example, the Athena Swan Charter. The Athena Swan Charter was introduced 12 years ago to progress the position of women in STEM subjects within higher education, and its main focus was specifically on gender. More recently, we've had the introduction of the Race Equality Charter, which works in a similar vein to the Athena Swan Charter, but its focus is clearly on race equality. In 2021, we had the publication of the Commission for Racial and Ethnic Disparities report, or the Sewell report as it is known. What was very disturbing and worrying about this report was that the report said, and I quote, they found no evidence of institutional racism in schools or indeed society or higher education. However, I argue that within policymaking, particularly in relation to higher education, gender has always been given precedence over race. So, for example, the main beneficiaries of the Athena Swan Charter have been white middle-class women. And consequently, even though we have had an increase in the numbers of Black and minority ethnic students attending higher education institutions in the UK and significant advances in policy making, I will show you today that inequalities in higher education continue to persist despite these advances. I just want to mention the term Black and minority ethnic. This is a highly contested and problematic term. It is, however, one that I use because it is used in the census, and it's also used so that we can make sense of policy making, particularly in relation to higher education. One of the things to remember about the term BME, or Black and minority ethnic, is that it does not actually assume that the BME group is a homogeneous category. It's important to understand and remember that there are differences within and between the BME category and indeed the BME groups. Next slide, please. So I thought it was really important to give you some kind of a picture or a context or a demography of BME students in UK higher education. So at the moment, BME individuals make up 14% of the minority ethnic population in the whole of the UK. And this was collected from a census that we do a census every 10 years. And this was the last census in 2011. We've just conducted a census here in the UK. The results don't come out until later on in the year. So it'll be very interesting to see if that number is still 14%. My hunch is it will be higher. So in 2018 to 19, 98.3% of UK students disclosed their ethnicity. Of those students, almost, well, a quarter, 25.3%, identified as being from a Black and minority ethnic background. And you can see there that 11.4% were Asian, 7.3% were Black, and so on and so forth. And the huge majority, 75.7%, were white. What's particularly interesting about the statistics is that it's the proportion of students who are Asian, and when I say Asian, I mean Indian, Pakistani, or Bangladesh for clarity. It's the proportion of students who are Asian and Black who have seen the most significant growth amongst all ethnic groups. So from the last 10 years, the statistics tell us that there's been a year-on-year increase for those groups. But what I'm going to show you is that whilst we have had this increase, these groups remain the most disadvantaged. Next slide, please. So let's talk about degree attainment. So the most recent statistics published in 2021 show us that if you are a white student, you are more likely to receive a first class or a 2-1 degree compared to BME students as a whole, as a population. However, as I've said, there are differences within and between that category. So Chinese, Indian, and mixed heritage students were more likely to receive a first. But it's the Black students, again, who are the most disadvantaged. Black African, Black Caribbean, and those from Black other backgrounds were less likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first. There is indeed a BME attainment or awarding gap of 10.8 percentage points, with the gap being particularly greatest again for the Black groups. So it's 20.1 for Black African groups, and it's 17.4 for Black Caribbean, and 23.7 for Black other students. And the BME attainment gap is far lower for those from Chinese, Indian, and mixed heritage backgrounds. Next slide, please. So let's talk about inequality, inequality, inequality. Black and minority ethnic students do achieve good A-level grades compared to white students on average. We have data to show that. There are differences, however, within the category. I should explain that A-level exams are public exams that students in the UK take at age 18. And the grades that they get for those A-level exams determine which universities they are able to go to. So I'm just taking a step back here. But what's particularly interesting is even when BME students do achieve comparable good A-level grades, they are less likely to be able to apply to selective universities such as Oxbridge or indeed the Russell Group. And the Russell Group is a group of 24 universities who are known for their excellence in teaching and research. So they are the elite universities, but Oxbridge is even higher up the hierarchy. And when BME students do apply, they are less likely to be offered places compared to white students who have comparable A-level results. And David Lammy has said that this is actually a system of social apartheid in which Black and minority ethnic students continue to be disadvantaged. And BME students remain underrepresented in prestigious elite Russell Group universities. Furthermore, it's Black students who are more likely to drop out of university, citing an ethnocentric curriculum and racism, not only from their peers, but also from staff. Next slide, please. So let's talk about privilege. One could say that I'm somewhat obsessed with the concept of privilege, very, very interested in not just white privilege, but privilege generally, which is what our current book is looking at, elites and the making of privilege. But this is a very interesting statistic. So 6.5% of school children in the UK attend independent fee-paying schools, what we call private schools, compared to 93% who attend state schools, which are non-fee paying. However, 55% of privately educated children progressed on to Russell Group institutions, including 6% who went on to study at Oxbridge, Oxford, or Cambridge. So I argue in my work that advantage is awarded to those who are already in an advantageous position, particularly in relation to their class, their wealth, and indeed their ethnic background. And I argue that processes of exclusion based on white privilege are actually affected by access to social, cultural, and economic capital, which affects those transitions that young people make into higher education. And if you believe, as I do, that education is a right and not a privilege, and that every individual, regardless of their economic background, their ethnicity, their gender, etc., is entitled to a quality education, I put it to you that this is not the case. Education has, in fact, and remains to be a privilege. Next slide, please. So I think it's really important when we're looking at these transitionary processes, it's important to look at those journeys of students through higher education. So from undergraduate to postgraduate taught, which are masters, and postgraduate research, which are PhDs. So whilst BME students have continued to have higher rates of transition to postgraduate taught degrees, it's white students who continue to have higher rates of transition to postgraduate research. They are the ones who are able to do PhDs. And our research shows that this is based on access to financial and economic capital, which in turn affects transitions to postgraduate study. And there's a huge amount of research, my own included, which shows that this actually affects future life chances, social mobility, and access to high-paying jobs within the labour market. Furthermore, BME students incur an ethnic penalty within the labour market. They are more likely to be unemployed 6 months after they graduate compared to white groups who have the same grades. This, of course, does vary by ethnic group, by gender, and indeed geographical location. Furthermore, we know that there is a BME ethnic pay gap which exists within higher education. And BME employees face a 3.2 billion annual pay penalty in the labour market, which has a huge impact in terms of labour market experiences and indeed position within the labour market itself. Next slide, please. So let's look at BME staff demographics. And again, this is really important to give you a context and a demographic picture of what's happening in the UK. So of those with known ethnicity, 10.8% of UK staff identified as BME. And the proportion of staff who are UK BME has shown an increase from almost 5% to almost 9%. And again, there's been a year-on-year increase for the proportion of staff who are UK BME. However, Amongst UK academic staff, only 5.2% of BME staff are heads of institutions. So out of 154 higher education institutions in the UK, we only have 6 vice-chancellors or presidents who are actually from a British BME background. And a total of 90.9% of professors are white, compared to only 3.6% Asian, 2.2 Chinese, 1.3 other, 1.2 mixed, and only 0.6% of Black. And again, it's the Black groups that remain the most disadvantaged. Furthermore, a larger proportion of white academics are more likely to be on the highest pay spine of 62,728 British pounds or more compared to BME staff when they are doing the same job. Next slide, please. So I thought it was important to show you this table, particularly in relation to the way the numbers are disaggregated for the BME total. So you can see there that almost 14,500 professors are white, and the total of BME is almost 1,500. But if you look at the Black category, there are only 100 Black professors in the whole of the UK, of which only 26 are women. Next slide, please. Those are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the racism that continues to persist in higher education for staff and students. It is, I would argue, racism that's business as usual. Next slide, please. So why is this happening? We have an assumption, don't we, that universities are progressive, they're liberal, they have social justice at the heart of their agendas, they are forward thinking, they are inclusive, and so on and so forth. Not so. Processes of racism, exclusion, and marginalisation continue to persist in higher education for both staff and indeed students. There are processes of conscious and indeed unconscious bias in higher education, where there are expectations from BME staff and stereotypes around BME students. So white middle-class students are seen as model students. Black male students are seen as aggressive students. Muslim students are seen as potential terrorists, and so on and so forth. And these stereotypes contribute to microaggressions and processes of overt and covert processes of racism, which is for staff affects their career promotion and their progression. And for students affects their whole university experience. Next slide, please. So let's talk about white privilege. So in my work, I draw on the work of Peggy McIntosh. And Peggy McIntosh argues that white privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions of maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. White privilege means you can go to a cafe and use the restroom and not be arrested. White privilege means you can walk through customs without being stopped. White privilege means that you are less likely to be stopped and searched by the police. White privilege means that you can shoot 2 people and walk out of the courthouse a free man. That's what white privilege is. And Derek Bell argues racist hierarchical structures govern all political, economic, and social domains. Such structures, he argues, allocate the privileging of whites in all arenas, including education. And in my work, I argue that there are different shades of whiteness and white privilege. There's acceptable and unacceptable, legitimate and illegitimate forms of whiteness. For example, gypsy and traveller groups who define and identify as white do not have the privileges afforded to white middle-class identity. Next slide, please. So I call it white policymaking, and I've talked very briefly about the policymaking that's relevant to today's talk. So who benefits from white policymaking? And again, Derek Bell argues that whites will advance the causes of racial justice only when doing so coincides with their own self-interest. And my colleague David Gilbourne argues the continued promotion of policies and practices that are known to be racially divisive testifies to a tacit intentionality in the system. So it's no accident that Black students are less likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first. It's no accident that Black students are more likely to be unemployed 6 months after they graduate. It's no accident that Black students are more likely to drop out of university than any other ethnic group. And Gloria Ladson-Billings argues that whites are the main beneficiaries of educational policymaking, even though they are designed to serve the marginalised. Just like white women have been the main beneficiaries of affirmative action in the US, white middle-class women have been the main beneficiaries of the Athena Swan Charter in the UK. Consequently, I argue, race takes a backseat. Every time race is mentioned, the question, what about us, is mentioned. What about gender? What about disability? I'm not disregarding the importance of those inequalities, but I am arguing that the same questions are not asked when, for instance, gender is given priority. And I argue that as long as white identity and white privilege are not threatened, yes, of course, white groups are supportive of diversity and inclusion programs such as affirmative action or indeed the Race Equality Charter. Consequently, I argue they can sell themselves as diverse and fair as long as their white privilege remains intact and unthreatened. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So I think it's really important when we're talking about white privilege and discussing how white privilege works. For me, I think it's really important to talk about what I call white space, and how those discourses and narratives around spatial awareness are absolutely vital or important when we understand the concept of white privilege. And Kobayashi and Peake argues that whiteness, yes, of course, we know that whiteness is a normative identity in which power and privilege are translated by controlling dominant values and institutions, and in particular, by occupying space within a segregated landscape which exists in higher education. And Hartigan argues, yes, of course, the meaning of race varies from location to location, but it also depends on the set of concerns against which it is prioritized, and other forms of consciousness, or indeed modes of reading within which it is ranked and arranged. And I argue that, yes, of course, universities are key spaces in which whiteness and white identities predominate, not just in the representation of white groups occupying senior decision-making roles, which I've just spoken about, but is also evidenced within the curriculum and indeed approaches to diversity, inclusion, and social justice. So consequently, we have under the EDI umbrella, race, I argue, gets consumed or subsumed within this umbrella where race always takes a backseat. Next slide, please. So what I hope I've done is I've started by talking about the policy making, I've given you some statistics, and now I'm going to talk about a piece of empirical research to demonstrate everything that I've just spoken about. So this was a piece of research that I originally carried out in 2016. And I carried out some more interviews for my book, White Privilege, in 2018. If you are particularly interested in this book, it was published in 2018 by Routledge. It's called The Unequal Academy, Experiences of BME Academics in the UK and the US. So I was particularly interested in exploring the experiences of BME academics, particularly in relation to how they were positioned within the academy. I wanted to examine the use and existence of support and indeed mentoring networks to analyse career progression and promotion. And I also wanted to investigate their experiences of exclusion and indeed marginalisation. So I used those two words because I wanted the respondents themselves to use their own language. And as you will see, that in describing or explaining their experiences of exclusion and marginalisation, it was racism. So that was the word that they used. So I didn't really want to put any words into my respondents' mouths. Next slide, please. So I conducted 65 in-depth semi-structured interviews with 35 academics working in the UK and 30 working in the US. I conducted face-to-face, telephone and Skype interviews. Individuals were given a consent form and a participatory information sheet to complete. They also had the opportunity at the end of the study to read their transcripts and change them should they wish to do so, and none said that they wanted to do so. What was particularly interesting about this study was that many of the respondents saw the interview as a therapeutic process. They said that it gave voice to their experiences, especially in relation to racism in higher education. They said that racism was rarely spoken about in their institutions, and something that individuals and their white colleagues felt that didn't actually exist, because the academy is seen to be, as I've already said, forward thinking, has social justice at the heart of its agenda, is liberal, and so on and so forth. So what was particularly important is that respondents felt that this gave them a space to talk about racism in their institutions and their own experiences of it. Next slide, please. So all of the interviews were recorded and the data subsequently transcribed. I used grounded theory to analyze my data. This was based on coding and developing themes in order to make sense of the language. I was particularly interested in the discursive elements of the research. And what was also very important about the research was my own identity and positionality within the research, my own race, my own gender, and my social class background. And for me, as a Black feminist researcher, power and reflexivity were hugely important, particularly not only in my epistemological and ontological approaches to my research, but also in relation to understanding how that notion of power works. So I argue that I would say in all of the research that we do, power is not a static process. Power is dynamic, and power can shift at all stages actually of the research relationship. So I found that in some instances it was clear that I had the power because I held the clipboard and it was me that was asking the questions and I could direct the way that the interview itself was going. But in other instances it was clear that it was the respondents that had the power because they could withhold information or tell me or give me responses that they felt that I wanted to hear. And I think as a Black feminist researcher, it's really important to understand how race within that notion of power and reflexivity is crucial, particularly in relation to our own positionality and indeed the position of our respondents. Next slide, please. So how were BME academics positioned within the academy? Well, respondents talked about their outsider-insider space, and many spoke about not being accepted within the white space. This was particularly the case in relation to their professional persona and their presentation of self. And again, it was predominantly Black women who talked about the ways in which their notions of credibility was linked to how they would be accepted within the academy. Excuse me. Many spoke about their dress, their language, or indeed their accent. And they felt that in some instances, they had to change the way they presented themselves, particularly in relation to how they would be judged, not just by their colleagues, but also by their students. And if you are interested in the presentation of self, Irvin Goffman writes beautifully about our different personas and the presentation of self. Next slide, please. And here are some quotes to demonstrate that. As a Black woman, I am aware of how I show myself to the world, how I dress, what I say, and how I say it. I know that I'll be judged by all of these things, and I have to make sure that I am professional all of the time. But I know that this is not always the case for my white colleagues. As a female of colour, I have to ensure that I am representing other females of colour, and that means being credible, being professional, and being seen this way. Next slide, please. So support networks were considered to be hugely important for all of the respondents. And there's quite a lot of research that exists around support networks and the ways that they differ for different individuals. Support networks can be through your colleagues or indeed your peers, and support can take place through emotional support, academic support, or indeed instrumental support. It exists inside and indeed outside the academy, and respondents talked about the different forms of support that this took place. It was face-to-face, or it was telephone, or indeed over Skype, and individuals had support networks that were 10,000 miles away, and this was actually pre-COVID. So Skype played a huge role back then anyway. The support also consisted of academic input, particularly in relation to career trajectories and career progression, where individuals felt they needed to publish, which journals, whether they would have somebody to read their drafts, their applications for funding, and all of those things that they needed to tick the box in order to ensure that they got promoted. And again, what was very interesting about this study was that successful career trajectories and promotion to senior roles, many of the academics talked about having access to what I call a network of knowns. The network of knowns are gatekeepers who hold the keys to understand what is really needed for promotion. And many of the BME academics, in fact, all of the BME academics felt they did not have access to this network of knowns. They did not have access to gatekeepers who knew the things that they needed to do in order to gain those promotions. Next slide, please. So the most important type of support that I've had is having access to a couple of experienced professors who have read my portfolio for my full professorship. They've been through the process and they can help me to improve on what I need to do. And that kind of support is vital. And another respondent said, I work in an environment that is predominantly white. And that means as a female woman of colour, I need to find support networks that understand that I am a woman of colour who will not be seen or positioned as a white woman or a white man. Next slide, please. Mentoring was also considered to be very important, particularly in relation to career progression and support. And there are different types of mentoring that exist in higher education. And I'd be interested to know what the situation is actually in Canada, because in the UK, universities are not obliged to have mentoring in place. So there's examples of really good practice, and there's also examples of very bad practice. And there's two types of mentoring: formal, which is developed by the academy, and informal mentoring, which is often based on individual connections. And in my research, I found that that was based on similar research themes, or indeed having an insider status. And for many of the academics, this was, I would say, probably all of the time, based on racial background, gender, and indeed class. Respondents talked about the timing of mentoring, particularly in relation to specific career points on their trajectories. And often this was in terms of promotion to professor, where individuals felt that that was the point at which they needed the most amount of mentoring, because it was considered to be a very difficult, position to meet. And I'm going to talk about that later. Respondents themselves also wanted to be mentored, but at the same time were very keen to mentor more junior colleagues, because they saw this as being not only beneficial for the individual mentees, but they wanted to give something back to their own communities, particularly minority communities, because they felt that they themselves did not have that mentoring because of the lack of BME academics in senior roles. Next slide, please. So we have several mentoring programs here, and they've been really good. I was given a mentor who is in the same faculty as me, who understood some of the issues and also my research area. And that worked in a great way for me. If my mentor was from a different faculty, I don't think that would work for me. There needs to be some common understanding. And another respondent said, I wanted to ensure that when I mentored, I could understand and empathize. For many women of colour, their experiences are very different because they are disadvantaged. And so it's better to have someone who can understand this. Next slide, please. So as I already mentioned, career promotion and progression was a huge theme that came up for all of the respondents. And individuals talked about the ways in which at one point their career hit the buffers. And this was usually when they were about to go for their full professorship or their tenure. And that was something where individuals felt that was really, they struggled the most with. At that point, they felt their prospects were limited and promotion itself was seen as an illusion. And whilst we know that there are specific criteria that have to be met for promotion, many of the respondents talked about a lack of transparency within the criteria, particularly in relation to what I call a nebulous set of criteria, which is related to the network of knowns. Respondents talked about the goalposts constantly moving when they went for promotion. And they felt that they were judged far more harshly than their white colleagues, and different criteria were reduced. So there was a process of surveillance, but also hyper surveillance when they went for promotion. And in some respects, many of them talked about the ways in which white women and white men were promoted over them, where they themselves were criticized on they had to bring in more money, they had to have more publications, they had to have done more administrative work, they had to have done more supportive work, whereas they saw their white colleagues who had done less than them, but they were promoted over and above them. Some of my respondents, though not all of them, were carrying out research on race and ethnicity and social justice. And when they were doing this kind of research, it was actually seen as deficit research or personal research. So you're only interested in this because you are a person of color. It's not considered valid as other pieces of research. There was also a recognition of research and publications outside the Anglo-American world. So some of the respondents were carrying out research in the Indian continent and the African continent and publishing in journals from those areas. And when that was the case, the academics felt that this research was not valued as much as research that was carrying out in the first world, or indeed being published in the UK, the USA, or indeed Europe. So there was this recognition of boundaries, if you like, of acceptable and unacceptable publications. And this academics spoke about this in relation to processes of microaggressions and overt and covert racism. Next slide, please. You kind of get to a certain point in your career when you really want to progress. And it's kind of, your career hits a brick wall and you don't know what to do. For us as people of colour, it's much harder. It's that additional thing of, will I be accepted by my peers as an equal? If you are conducting and writing about racial injustice or other types of inequalities and you are Black, it's not seen as proper research. It's seen as being personal and not judged as being objective. That makes it harder to get further on in your career if your research is not valued. And next slide, please. So process of exclusion and marginalisation, and again, as I said, I didn't want to use the word racism myself, but time and time again, every respondent talked about covert and overt forms of racism that they experienced from their colleagues and indeed students. None of the individuals that I spoke to said they hadn't experienced racism, which I think in itself is a very interesting finding. Because research that I've done since then, some BME academics have actually said, well, I haven't experienced any racism. So I think this is particularly interesting finding. There was a lack of BME representation at senior decision-making roles, particularly professorial roles, and the data that I've showed you actually bears that out, which continue to reinforce BME academics being positioned as outsiders or others. And I've talked about their acceptance and credibility, not just to their colleagues, but also to students. So it was very interesting to note that many of the BME academics talked about the emotional labour that they did for BME students, and quite often BME students would come to them because they were also of a BME background, and quite often this emotional labour that goes on in supporting students is not accounted for on workload. So it's additional labour that BME academics felt they had to do. And when they did complain about racism, complaints about racism was simply dismissed as a clash of personalities. Oh, it isn't racism, it's just that you don't get on with that individual. Consequently, there was a refusal of the existence of racism within higher education and indeed racist practices. It's what I call a discourse of denial. And what was particularly interesting is that when individuals did make complaints about racism, in most of those cases, the complaints process was not fit for purpose, and the complaints about racism were not investigated with due process. And many of the academics felt that consequently they didn't want to make those complaints, because what happened is when they did make the complaints, it almost switched around. So the victims became the villains, and so they were blamed themselves about daring to mention that racism actually exists. So it was really interesting the ways in which these different layers took place around complaints of racism. Next slide, please. It's subtle. It's not overt, so you can't see it or prove it. You can't bring it out or challenge it. It's not tangible. So how do I challenge that? It makes it harder when you feel it's racism, but you can't really prove it. They see me as a Black female and so judge me based on that. They judge me based on a stereotype, and all their views then go back to that stereotype. So you find yourself always having to ensure that you are reacting to that stereotype because you don't want to be defined by the stereotype. And one academic said, I am constantly aware of being an outsider. Next slide, please. So where are we? I'm coming to the end of my talk. Are these new or are they just old racisms? So I chose these 3 quotes because I think they're very good quotes, but also because of the dates. So please take a note of the dates. So the first quote is by Bonilla, Silva and Foreman, and that was in 2000. So that's 22 years ago. And Bonilla, Silva and Foreman said, a new race talk has emerged in the reproduction of white supremacy, which allows whites to appear not racist, to preserve their privileged status, to blame Blacks for their lower status, and criticize any institutional approach, such as affirmative action, that attempts to ameliorate racial inequality. And the next quote is a piece of research that we carried out 11 years ago, looking at what happened in schools when Black and minority ethnic parents complained about racism when their children experienced racism in rural areas, predominantly white areas. And this is what we said in 2011. To argue that post-Macpherson, so post-Macpherson was a report that was published prior to the Race Relations Amendment Act, which defined institutional racism. And the rhetoric at that time was that because we had this report and the Race Relations Amendment Act, that we were all post-racial. And this is what we said in 2011. To argue that post-Macpherson has resulted in a post-racial society is utterly absurd. Such discourses serve only to further disadvantage and marginalise Black and minority ethnic communities. We argued that racism exists at every level of society. It permeates our schools, our colleges, and indeed our universities. It is alive in all elements of society, our popular culture, our media, and the social spaces that we occupy. And in 2018, I said, higher education institutions are spaces of white privilege, which fail to cater for the experiences of BME groups. They employ a rhetoric of inclusion, but one that is rarely evidenced in practice or outcomes. I put it to you that these aren't new racisms in 2022. These are just old racisms. This is, I argue, racism, which is business as usual. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? So I want to end on a positive note, if I can. So I think it's really important to understand the importance of intersectionality within all of our experiences in higher education and the impact of race, class, and gender, and how that specifically plays out in the experiences of higher education. I think it's really important that all universities must collect good qualitative and quantitative data to ensure that good practice is being shared, because currently, certainly in the UK, this isn't happening. And I'd like to know what the good practice and ways forward are in the Canadian context, actually. We need a greater visibility of BME staff, particularly in academic senior decision-making roles. We need transparency in the recruitment and the progression systems. So, for example, we cannot have quota systems in the UK because quota systems are illegal, but we can have target systems where universities must have targets for the numbers of BME staff in senior roles. And every time I mention this, people say, oh, but this will be a tokenistic appointment. It's a lowering of standards. I'm not talking about a lowering of standards. So in the Equality Act, we have a clause that if you have two individuals who are one person's from a BME background and one person is from a white background, and they have the same criteria, you must employ the BME individual. But this never happens because, I've been on numerous interview panels and two people are never the same, but I suggest we need a target system for the numbers of BME staff in senior roles. every university must have formal networking and mentoring and training in place for individuals who want to apply for promotion and progression, particularly to include mandatory unconscious bias training, at the very least for those who are on recruitment and progression and promotion panels. I mean, I know that there are huge problems. I'm aware of UCB training and race equality training, and perhaps this is something that we can talk about later, but at the very least, if it's done well, it can work. All universities must provide annual reviews and clear plans which provide evidence in how they are addressing racism and indeed the attainment or the awarding gap. Now, I know that at the moment in the UK, universities are expected to do this and they are doing it, but at the same time, I argue, we must have a target system again for the numbers of BME students who are able to attend Russell Group and elite universities, because currently the numbers are very low. And we must link the Race Equality Charter mark to funding, as is the case to Athena Swan. I talked about the Athena Swan initiative early on. That's the gender initiative. And when it was introduced that universities could not apply for biomedical funding if they were not signed up to the Athena Swan Charter. And the number of institutions that signed up to that charter within 1 week increased by 400%. So money doesn't talk, money screams. So we must link the Race Equality Charter mark to funding, as is the case with the Athena Swan Charter. And I hesitate to say the next one about national government policies, which apply to all higher educations, where individuals must have race equality at the heart of their agenda. I don't see that with this current government, this Conservative government. We've had Kemi Badenoch stand up in the House of Commons, who denounced critical race theory and who does not believe that white privilege is a thing. And also, as I've said in the Sewell report, that they found no evidence of institutional racism. So I hesitate with our current government as it stands. And again, I'd be interested to hear the Canadian perspective. Finally, higher education institutions must acknowledge and address institutional racism and indeed white privilege. They must have these uncomfortable and difficult conversations in terms of how to progress higher education. What impact does institutional racism and white privilege have on staff and students and the curriculum, the numbers of the types of students and numbers of students that come to the university, the staff that you employ, and so on, and the whole institutional culture around what this means. And finally, why is this important? This is important because a failure to acknowledge racism results in a failure to act upon it. Thank you very much. And the next slide, please. And that's a copy of my book available in all good bookshops. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Wow, thank you very much for that fantastic talk. I know there are there's some questions in the Q&A, and also I should say, I mean, even when you were going, I think people were wanting to make sure they were going to have access to the video, right? In order to take in more further. There's some similarities I'm noticing. It's good for comparative research for those of us who do comparative studies between UK, US, and Canada. And you were saying you'd be interested in that. And one would I would say you use the language of BAME, Black and remember we had this conversation because we use the language of visible or racialized minorities in Canada, and that includes South Asians, East Asians, West Asians. We actually it's just Black, Japanese, Korean, and so there's a whole, I think there's like 13 groups that are included in that. And there are also, as you know, if you disaggregate the data, there are variations. I'm actually interested then in this, because you've given several instances around attainment, where this may vary. We have something similar here with Chinese and what we call the Chinese and South Asian. So South Asian here would include India, with Pakistan, Bangladesh, but also Sri Lanka, Guyanese, Trinidad. So it would capture all of that diversity. But there are variations between those groups, and say the white population and Black populations, whose actual numbers are more similar than compared to those two. So I'm interested, though, if you could flesh out a bit more you've done this fabulously detailed research. If you could flesh out more the evidence that you see in terms of the stages of these academic, if you want to call it pipeline. Some people do K-12 to universities, and some people just do universities from undergraduate to, all the way through, whether they complete or whether they are pushed out. If in your research, are there parts of the pipeline or pathway that you see are particularly challenging and problematic, or that are more responsive to your conclusions than other parts of the pathway of pipelines, and how that may vary? Again, you were clear about the different differences within BAME, but also the intersections that might exist. There are some things, because I know in Britain, there's the language of Black, of a political Blackness, and that resonates quite differently than it might do here in Canada. So so I'm interested in those nuances and distinctions and the lessons we can learn from them here in Canada too.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. What an excellent question, or several questions actually, fantastic questions. So there's two things I would like to say about the pipeline. So there's the student pipeline and then the staff pipeline. So regarding staff pipeline, many academics get to a certain position in their career, and it's usually the point before full professor. So in the US, it's full tenure, and in the UK, it's associate professor or reader. So that's, and it takes me back to those statistics that I showed you at the beginning, and that shows that my qualitative research shows that's a fact, because we only have 100 Black professors, right, in the UK, and smaller numbers of Asian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi. So their career hits the buffers at that point. And what happens at that point is it's almost as though there's a failure to progress to that next level. And the way that I talk about that is that the white space of higher education wants to continue to be white. So one of the ways that whiteness is perpetuated is by not promoting Black and minority ethnic academics. So in some ways, one could argue, or I would argue, it's so that this is a very critical race theory perspective. I'm not going to apologize for it, but that's my perspective, right? So it's to keep them in their place, right? It's to make sure that they know their place. And part of this process, whether it's conscious or unconscious, and critical race theories would argue it's conscious, it's in order to uphold the white racial order. It's in order to uphold white supremacy. And part of that is the manifestation of racism, because racism is endemic, racism is a fact. That's why I was really upset when the CRED report came out and said they found no evidence of institutional racism. And we know that kind of language is perpetuated by the far right across the world. There's been a huge rise since Black Lives Matter, which was this huge eruption and explosion where we all felt was a moment. But in fact, it's created a backlash because there's been a huge rise of the far right in the UK, the US, and in Europe. So that's one pipeline. In terms of the student pipeline, that's really an interesting question, because I think what we have to do is we have to step back. So when students come to us in higher education, in some respects, it's too late. That's why I gave the statistics around schooling and private schools. So when you have families who live in poor areas where schools are underfunded, they're more likely to be from BME backgrounds. So consequently, their schooling experiences are not as good as individuals who maybe go to private schools where they're paying fees, or better areas. So schools are underfunded, so they have the teachers, that there's a large turnaround of teachers and so on. So their negative experiences start at school, and there's a huge amount of data, and my own included, shows that BME students experience racism from their teachers, from their peers, in the classroom. And I don't know what the teaching workforce is like in Canada, but in the UK, it's white. It's predominantly white. Teachers here and head teachers are more likely to be white and female. So there are no role models for the BME students. So that it starts off at school and then it carries on in higher education. And my research has also shown that another pipeline that exists, and we know this, that the decision that students make in the third year of their undergraduate research, in the undergraduate degree, in their final year, has a huge impact on social mobility, future life chances, and access to the labour market. So some of the students that we spoke to, some current research that I'm working on, which will be published next year, Black students, especially Black male students, were saying, I know that I'm hoping to get a 2-1 or a first when I leave university, but that is not going to shield me from the racism that I will experience in the labour market. If there is somebody who has a lesser degree than me, but they are white and middle class, they will get the job over me. And, you know, the social, economic and political climate in the UK since Brexit has legitimised racism in every arena, because, you know, just 52% of people were voted to leave the EU. And the day after the result was announced, there was a huge increase in the number of reported racist crimes. And that's why I wanted to talk about, is this new or old racism? So my point is that in some ways, we've gone back rather than going forward because of the backlash associated with Black Lives Matter, President Trump, Brexit, etc. Sorry, that's a really, really long-winded answer. So forgive me, it wasn't meant to be that long.
No, thank you for that. It involves some of the questions that were popping up in the chat. People wanted some comparative analysis and data. There's a number of questions about students, and I think you took some of that up. It's one of the questions that I think might I may not have been touched on as much is, how do we tackle this issue of internalized or internal racism? And I know in the UK there's this huge debate about also the ways in which certain race BAME politicians are brought in, and the question about how they become implicated or complicit in reproducing the current or prevailing order. And there's a pretty high profile one. So how do you account for that? Is that class and or internalized racism? What's going on there?
That's a really excellent question. And I think that is absolutely true. You know, we have high profile Black and Asian politicians who stand up in the House of Commons and say there's no such thing as racism. It's not about race, it's about class. And it's really, really interesting how that works. And from a critical race theorist perspective, it's what Derek Bell talks about, the rules of racial standing. So who best than a Black person or an Asian person to denounce racism and to say that, well, actually, racism doesn't exist. Look at me, I made it. I'm in the House of Commons, or I have a high profile role. So all you have to do is you need to work hard, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You know, there's this myth of a meritocracy that if you do well and you work hard, you'll succeed. But, well, we know that the word meritocracy is not a real concept anyway, but that's not the case, because what that perspective does is it doesn't look at the structural and institutional racism that you've spoken about, and the racism that's embedded within all of our institutions. And furthermore, the class debate is I find extremely frustrating and challenging, because what happens is that when people talk about class, they talk about class and then they ignore race, and my response to that is, we have Bangladeshi and Pakistani groups who are some of the most poorest in this country, living in some of the most poorest areas. Not only do they experience the disadvantages associated with their working class identity, which is poverty, which is unemployment, bad schooling, you know, lack of access to books and materials. In addition to those disadvantages, they also experience racism. So the Black working class is forgotten about in some respects. So I think that that is really frustrating. So in this country, it's all about the white working class. The white working class have been left behind. But I think that that is actually related to the rhetoric and discourse of the current government that we have, which does have, as you rightly say, Black and minority ethnic individuals in huge positions of power. And one of the things that they also do is they use a deficit model, and they blame the individual. It's your fault, you need to work harder. And they also blame families. So there's the stereotypes of Black families being from single parent families, education isn't valued, and so on. And in some respects, it depresses me because, you know, I've been doing this for nearly 30 years, and it's the same arguments that were used 25 years ago, which are all based on stereotypes. So my point is that the way that race and racism is understood is very much influenced and dependent upon the government rhetoric that is public. So, you know, we've had Prime Minister Boris Johnson calling Muslim women letterboxes openly. And when he said that, the racism that Muslim people experience went up by something like 385% within 2 weeks. So, and you have Donald Trump who said, you know, all Mexicans are rapists, etc., etc. So when this rhetoric is public, then it's legitimized. And that goes through into schools and universities.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm just make sure I try to keep track of these questions. And so here's someone wanting to draw comparisons here, Michael Kerr. In theory, the federal employment equity legislation in place in Canada since 1986 works to help ensure fair and equitable labor market access and opportunities across higher education, but you say in the workplace. Is there an equivalent? And I would say, I actually would argue that the legislation in the UK is a little stronger than the Employment Equity Act. You have the race equality, you mentioned that in the beginning. So they're just wanting some further elaboration on the race, on your kind of Race Equality Act. We don't have something like that in Canada. And I think because that's equality more broadly than just employment, as I understand that. But then you have the whole slew of the Athena SWAT, the Race Equality Charter. And I know there's a whole debate about how effective that is, especially in comparison to the Athena Swan that's in Ireland and Australia now, and much more robust and better resource. So actually, you know, it might be useful if you could talk about that, the way in which the Athena Swan and the race charter play out in terms of your research on the race and gender, and how gender gets privileged in relation to race despite intersectionality conversations.
Yeah, again, those are really good questions. So just in terms of what you said first, we have the Equality Act, which I talked about. And the Equality Act is a really important piece of legislation because it includes protected characteristics. And race is a protected characteristic. And that means that every organization, every employment organization, every school has a public sector equality duty where they have to advance equality of opportunity. And so there are certain protective characteristics that have to be adhered to. So you have to be mindful of racial background. You have to be mindful of sexuality, and so on and so forth. So that is a really important piece of legislation. But my criticism of the Equality Act is that in bringing together all the legislation, racial inequality has actually been diluted. Now, in relation to your question on the Athena Swan Charter and the Race Equality Charter, I think that's, again, a really, really good question, because what we have is, whilst the Athena Swan Charter was introduced about 12 or 13 years ago, the Race Charter is far newer. But what my research shows is that when you talk to individuals who are part of the groups that are participating in the charter marks, there's always the notion that race is not considered to be as important. So I can remember some quotes when I did this research. So the first thing that somebody said was that, why should we have the race charter mark? Because there are 51% of women in society. So therefore, gender is more important. That was the first issue that was raised. Secondly, universities said to us that we haven't got many BME students or staff in our institution, and we live and our population is predominantly white. So why should we invest in the Race Equality Charter? So what you have is what I called, you've already got a crowded equalities agenda because there's so many different inequalities within that. So what happens is, I argue, is you have a hierarchy of oppression. Within that hierarchy of oppression, gender always takes precedence, and historically gender has taken precedence. So let's look at feminism. White feminism in the UK was not interested in my experiences or the experiences of women of colour. Feminism was only interested in the experiences of white women, and they were not interested in issues to do with race. In fact, it's white middle class women. So historically, gender has taken precedence. And if you look at the statistics, white women from both working and middle class backgrounds have hugely benefited from policy making in higher education. So the statistics on gender in terms of senior roles, in terms of promotion, are much better. And the progress there is you can put your finger on it and see it. Whereas when conversations are had about funding, the funding always goes to gender, because the argument is, well, actually, there's 51% of women in the population. And also the argument then goes to, we should look at gender because gender is related to caring responsibilities. And regardless of your ethnic background, you're going to have caring responsibilities. So consequently, race gets subsumed in the argument, and all the funding and the rhetoric is around gender equality.
There are some parallels here, but I leave that because there are so many questions. So there's a question here about using quotas or targets, but also using a strengths-based approach. Some associate a deficit model with underrepresented groups when using these targets. And so I take from that, you talk about we need to have targets or metrics to actually track our progress or advancement. But then when you say you try to meet those targets, people say they raise the questions of excellence or quality or merit. And then there's assumption of either we don't have any, so it's a supply prop issue. There isn't a supply issue. The question is they don't get hired into the academy. That's not a supply issue or availability issue in Canada so much in terms of who achieves PhDs, for example. But so the question then is, how is that deficit model then and that deficit thinking shaping or mitigate or limiting or circumscribing the ability to actually think seriously about targets? And certainly I would say quotas would have a really, they're associated with affirmative action, and that not the Scandinavian versions of quotas, and they're seen as deficit as well. So this person wants to understand, how do you get out of that deficit model when you're trying to have ameliorative programs to deal with underrepresented groups? Big challenge in Canada.
Yeah, that's a really good question again. I don't know if I know the answer to it, quite frankly, because it is a really, really difficult one. Because quite often when quotas and, look at affirmative action, right? Affirmative action was for Black, African Americans and minoritized groups, but the group that's benefited the most from affirmative action have been white women. So that is an excellent example. And I think that the danger, I think, of having this approach is that it becomes people will say it's tokenistic and we're just ticking the box. It's box ticking. How do you counter that? I really don't know. I think that as I said, we have a clause in the Equality Act where you have two individuals and one's a BME person, you have to hire them. I think that there should be penalties, financial penalties for universities who don't do these things. And part of me thinks that why should we have to justify it, that it isn't tokenistic? Can you not just take our word for it, that this person is hired because they're good at what they do? And that they experience institutional and structural racism in higher education. So part of my response is that, because we've never had to justify it for gender, have we? We've never had to say, oh, we need X number of women on our panels. So why should we have to justify it for gender, for race? And I think that this is where it's really important to have those uncomfortable conversations. And I said, a failure to acknowledge racism results in a failure to act upon it. But that's also about white privilege. I think we need to talk about whiteness and white privilege and how that predominates within higher education, not just within our staff body, and also within our student body, and how that manifests itself from HE into the labour market.
So maybe we have time for one more question. And I'm looking, so I'm trying to pull together several of these inside the chat here. One question relates broadly to curriculum, and where you see so the changes in the student compositions and the courses they're selecting, whether that's likely to have an impact on these institutions. And I know, for example, many institutions in the UK had all this movement around Rhodes must fall in South Africa, but then there was the Rhodes stuff, but there's also, why is my curriculum so white at some of the universities? And so there's a whole kind of curriculum conversation that I think was much deeper and more widespread. And is that kind of curriculum conversation shaping? I mean, I can think of caveats to what I'm saying even as I speak, because especially around African studies and people being hired temporarily and as part-time rather than as full-time continuing positions. So if you could talk a little bit more about that kind of dynamic around curriculum and the implications for change.
So what has been particularly interesting here, and I'm sure it's the same in the Canadian context, is after the eruption or the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement, what's been really interesting since then in higher education is that universities now suddenly see the need to decolonizing their curriculum. Okay, and I say that in inverted commas because nobody seems to know what it means. Universities themselves that are decolonizing the curriculum, when I ask them what does that mean, they can't really explain it. Right. So part of me thinks it's a bandwagonist term, a bit like intersectionality, right? Buzzword, everyone uses it, but no one says what it is. So lots of universities have been attempted to decolonize their curriculum. And in some cases it's working well, in other cases it's just a tick box exercise. But what's really important where it works well is, and this is my personal view, is that decolonizing the curriculum isn't just about changing your reading lists to include minority writers and academics. It's more than that. It's about what you teach, it's about how you teach it, and it's about who's teaching it, and it's about understanding. It's about a university understanding their own role in imperialism, in colonialism, and where were these who built these universities? Where did the money come from? It's quite easy to tell who built those universities and what they were, foundations from which they were built on. So I think it's more than just having and changing reading lists, and we're at the beginning of it in the UK. We still have a long way to go, but in some cases it is working well. But I think that it isn't just about the curriculum; it's a holistic perspective. And as you said just now, that you need to hire individuals with permanent contracts who are given the support to further their careers, rather than just ticking a box and saying, we're applying for the Race Equality Charter Mark. We're going to say that we're going to decolonize the curriculum. Let's just hire a BME academic on a short-term contract, and then they leave. And we know the exploitation in universities, short-term contracts or 0 hours contracts. You don't get sick pay, you don't get holiday pay, and we did some research on this a few years back, and we found that individuals who were paid hourly, when they were paid something like 35 UK pounds an hour. And when that was worked out in terms of marking and preparation, it was less than they were paid in a supermarket. So, this is real exploitation going on in HE for 0 hours contracts and short-term contracts. So I think that, that's a whole can of worms, right? In terms of working conditions.
And certainly nothing decolonial or anti-colonial or about that kind of exploitation there. There are just tons of questions. impossible to answer all of them. I just want to see if Dr. Balsa wants to make a comment or have a comment before I close, or if there, I mean, you see the questions too, I think. If there's one that you really want to respond to, you know, let me know. Because there's a bunch that I would love to ask, but I'm just gonna have you back. So yeah, Terry.
Sure, I'm happy to just, I won't even try to touch the questions myself. There's some really important ones there, but I know, thank you so much, Dr. Bhopal, for that. I thought it was fantastic, and it really, it left me feeling, rather than just depressed, actually inspired to really take action. You know, the approach is, you know, immediately thinking, how can we support? How can we provide those networks of support? How can we really address some of the just really critical issues? I'm looking forward to reading your book, which I admit I haven't yet, so I'm glad to find out about it, and also reviewing the video as well. So I really, truly thank you so much for your time with us today. And I look forward to the ongoing conversation and actions.
Thank you so much. I do hope that I've done something, or at least made people think about things. And thank you so much to everyone. And in solidarity, keep fighting the fight.
Well, so again, then thank you, Dr. Balsa. I really appreciate your being here, knowing what's on your plate, only a slice of what's on your plate. I greatly appreciate the time and the engagement. So, so thank you so much, Dr. Bhopal. We will definitely continue this conversation. You will get to come to Calgary at some point. Beautiful location. Thanks for all of the conversations and the volumes of questions that we haven't been able to address. I just want to, before we close, I just want to say to everyone here, this is EDI Week 2022. Lots of events happening. This is our final keynote, but there are lots of events happening throughout the week and hosted by other units on campus. As well as, you know, there is Black History Month, and we will be releasing the schedule for that in a day or so. And again, that's hosted by units across campus. And I think this presentation by Dr. Bhopal is a fantastic segue to Black History Month conversations on campus, and then Women's History Month that follows after that. So again, thank you to Provost and Vice President Academic, Dr. Terry Balsa, for the introduction to our keynote speaker and for the engagement. Thank you to all of our participants. Thank you for your questions, your comments, and all of you who are here with us this afternoon. If you're looking for more information on EDI Week, I think Tracy Garrick put the link in the chat group, but it's ucalgary.ca/equity-diversity-inclusion. Please look for the link to the EDI Week 2022 under events, news and events, for more information on these events and our speakers. We will be releasing the video for all of you who have registered. It will, the events team will be sending that out, and it will be hosted on our website as well, along with further readings that for you to follow up and deepen your understanding based on the research and scholarship of Dr. Bhopal. So again, thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, and happy Lunar Year, Year of the Tiger, and happy Black History Month. Please continue the learning efforts. Take care.